My name is Raymar Vettner. Welcome to video number 5 in this quarter's video series about how to use the Logos Biblesoftware to prepare your Sabbath School lessons on the Gospel of Luke. Before we begin, some family news. I'm very proud about my wife, who 1.5 weeks ago passed her PhD defense at Andrews University in the Old Testament. Her dissertation was on the book of Psalms and hope, eschatology, Messiah in the book of Psalms. So you might recognize some of the professors standing in the picture on her side. So that was some good news from the Vettner family. This week the Sabbath School lesson is talking about Sabbath, Jesus and the Sabbath. So my plan for you in this video is to talk a little bit about library management, how to manage the books you have in your Logos software so that you can easily find things, like how to search for a Bible reference in a collection. So in order to make a collection or to tag resources, I need to first show you how to manage your books. We are going to spend quite a lot of time on what recent scholars are saying about Judaism, Jesus and Sabbath keeping. So this week might be a little bit less logos and a bit more teaching about the Bible and scholarship. Christian scholarship today is a lot more sympathetic to Judaism than it was just a generation ago. Today we know a lot more about Judaism because the Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered, teaching us a lot about Judaism that we didn't know before. For instance, a lot of material in the fourth Gospel of John, about light and darkness. People earlier thought this must be some Greek Gentile influence on the gospel. This isn't Jewish. But then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it turns out language like dark and light is very much part of Judaism. We know a lot more about the rabbinic literature, like the Mishnah. A lot of the rabbis who are discussing how to interpret different parts of the Torah, different parts of the Bible. A lot of those rabbis lived at the time of Jesus, and what they believed about how to interpret the commandments is written down in the Mishnah. So Mishnah and Talmud is what we call rabbinic literature. That literature had always been there, but Christian scholars hadn't spent so much time reading it. To be honest, we knew a lot less about Judaism at the time of Jesus, even though Christian scholars of the New Testament are supposed to know a lot about Judaism. You can't understand the New Testament if you don't understand Judaism. But despite that, rabbinic literature wasn't really studied that much by Christian New Testament scholars. There's also a lot more personal interaction between Jewish and Christian scholars today. So today we are more sympathetic to Judaism, and we know a lot more. After the Holocaust, we are also much more aware of our own anti-Semitic tendencies. You know, it was in a Christian Protestant country that Nazism arose. And how could that happen? People claiming to be followers of Jesus had somehow forgotten that Jesus was a Jew, and they killed Jesus' people. So after the Holocaust, we as Christian scholars have been thinking through, maybe there is some elements of our theology that is a bit anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. Maybe we should change our thinking in some areas. And some of the scholars who have really contributed to changing our view of scholarship in a much more positive way is E.P. Sanders in his 1977 book about Palestinian Judaism. And this has led to a lot of movements in New Testament scholarship, like the new perspective on Paul, the third quest for the historical Jesus, a lot of back to the Jewish roots movements. So today, things look a lot different than it did just a generation ago. Unfortunately, this quarter's Sabbath School lesson doesn't really reflect this growing knowledge of the complexity of Judaism at the time of Jesus. Doesn't really reflect this increased sympathy towards Judaism. It appears to me that this manuscript for this quarter's lesson was written probably a couple of decades ago. At least that's the attitude it reflects. Just to give you a few examples, in Monday's lesson, page 40 in the English lesson, it says in the middle of the page, the Jews expected the kingdom of God to come at some time in the future in a dramatic militaristic way. uprooting an alien regime from Judea and ushering in the Davidic throne. So these bad Jews, they expected a political, militaristic Messiah, but we Christians, we know so much better. We know that Jesus is wanting to change our hearts instead. We are more spiritual. This is a fairly common way of describing the eschatology of Judaism and Christianity. What the lesson does not point out is that what Adventists and Christians today are expecting is exactly the same kind of dramatic, militaristic entrance of the Messiah. In the second coming of Jesus, we expect Jesus to do pretty much what the Jews expected him to do when they waited for him the first time. The difference is we know he already came the first time. But what we expect is pretty well summarized in that sentence, what the Jews expected. So why not point out that we Christians expect pretty much the same today? It kind of puts unnecessary negative spin on what the Jews expected. It's true, this is what they expected, but to then go on to say that but Jesus was saying that the kingdom had already come in his person, and that he would break the power of sin, crush the devil, and free the oppressed captives of his domain. This is very true. As Christians, we believe that the kingdom has already come. The king was already here, and he ushered in a new messianic period where Jesus did conquer the devil and has liberated us from sin and the devil in a way that didn't happen before he came. So this is true. We need a lot more kingdom theology in our Adventist thinking today. We need to realize that Jesus did make a difference 2,000 years ago, and today we have been liberated in a way that humanity wasn't before. So that's all good. But to put this contrast between Judaism and Jesus, I think that contrast in that paragraph is unnecessary, because we believe exactly the same as the Jews did. We are now waiting for the dramatic militaristic entrance of our king, who's going to throw away all the bad pagan Gentiles ruling this world with their immoral governments. That's what we're waiting for, King Jesus. Another example of the kind of lack of sympathy, one-way negative description of Judaism is found in the way this week's lesson is using the word legalism. It's using it in a couple of places. On Sunday's lesson, it talks about people who accuse Adventists of being legalists because we keep the Sabbath. You know, we are so tired of people calling us legalists because we keep the Sabbath. And you know that's a good point. We are not legalists. The Sabbath is a blessing for us, and we don't keep the Sabbath in order to be saved. We keep it because we are saved, because we are God's people, and we want to receive the benefits he wants to give us on the Sabbath. So we're not legalists. I agree with that statement. But two other times where the lesson is using the word legalism, it's using it about the Jews and Sabbath keeping. On Wednesday, first paragraph, it says that the Pharisees twisted the way of keeping the Sabbath, and the Pharisees, through a long history of legalism, have heaped rule upon rule, tradition upon tradition, turned the Sabbath from the joy it was supposed to be into a burden instead. Yeah, it is true that for a lot of Jews at the time of Jesus, Sabbath had turned into a burden instead of a joy. But I think we ought to recognize as Adventists who keep the Sabbath that that's very much a possibility for us today as well. Exactly how do you keep the Sabbath? What is right and what is wrong to do on Sabbath is very much a complex and difficult and important discussion. It was a discussion at the time of Jesus. How do you keep the Sabbath? It was a big discussion. If you read a lot in the rabbinic literature, there is a tractate in the Mishnah, for instance, and a lot of other rabbis, different Mekiltas, different commentaries on the Pentateuch. You will see that Sabbath keeping was a big discussion. How do you keep it? Just like we as Adventists have a big discussion today. For instance, in some cultures in the world, Adventists don't go to the beach and swim on Sabbath. But in some cultures we do. Now, is it right for me, who take a swim on Sabbath, to call those Adventists who do not think it's appropriate to take a swim on Sabbath, is it appropriate for me to call them legalists? I don't think that's very helpful. Or the other way, there are in some cultures, Adventist theology students who do homework on the Sabbath, they write exegesis papers or they read required readings because, it's the Bible, it's theology, so they think it's alright. Personally, I think it's not alright. You should do some reading in the Bible or in theological literature that is not directly relevant for your homework and your degree, because it's Sabbath. Take the day off from your daily duties. But is it right for me to label those people who do required readings on Sabbath as legalists? Yeah. Or they should call me legalists because I refuse to do those things. It's probably the other way, huh? They might call me legalist because I want to avoid those things on Sabbath. Well, I don't think labels like legalist when you're talking about Sabbath keeping is very useful. It's muddying the discussion. We need to have a good discussion about how to keep the Sabbath. That's an appropriate discussion to have. And when we disagree, let's do it cordially, please. And the same applies to people at the time of Jesus. Yes, maybe some of them had misunderstood the way of keeping the Sabbath and kept it unnecessarily in a way that was a burden. But I don't think Jesus did disagree with some of the ways some of the Jews kept the Sabbath, but I don't think Jesus needs us to throw around the word legalists unnecessarily. That's my little opening statement before we look at Logos and this week's lesson. In Matthew 23 verse 2 and 3, Jesus said that the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Moses' seat was a piece of furniture in the synagogue up front. That's where the rabbi was sitting down when he was doing the preaching. He stood up to read from the Bible scrolls, and then he sat down on Moses' seat. That's what it was called, to do the preaching. And Jesus says that's where the Pharisees are sitting, in the synagogues on the seat of Moses. They are explaining, interpreting the Torah. So do and observe whatever they tell you. In Jesus' view, the Pharisees were fairly close to himself in their theology. The theology of the Pharisees were pretty good overall. Jesus can give them a theological blank check and say, do whatever they tell you, because overall their interpretation of the books of Moses is pretty good. Of course, there are things he disagreed with, and we can see that throughout the Gospels. But his main problem with the Pharisees was that they were too liberal in their own lives. They preach and don't practice. So they live too liberal lives. They're too hypocritical. They preach one thing and don't always do it. That's one of Jesus' main problems with many Pharisees. But their theology, their interpretation is fairly good, so close to Jesus' own understanding that he can give this blank check. Observe whatever they tell you. Of course, he doesn't agree with everything, but he agrees with such a substantial amount that he can say this sentence. So in your mind, if your Jesus can't endorse the Pharisees that you have in your mind in this way, maybe it's time to revise the picture you have of Judaism and the Pharisees, because it is a bit more complex than a lot of Christians, including this week's lesson, make it out to be. So the menu for today, for this week, in this video is, I'm going to show you some library management so you can search for a Bible reference in a collection or in a tag. We're going to look at what some scholars are saying about Judaism, Jesus and Sabbath keeping, and venturing outside Jesus and Judaism, let me just quickly look at what Paul possibly might say or not say about the Sabbath in some texts, Romans 14, Colossians 2, that a lot of people think is about the Sabbath. So they are important texts, and there are some Logos resources I want you to know about when it comes to Romans and Colossians related to the Sabbath. So let's get going. Let's turn into the Logos software. Alright, so now I'm in Logos, and let's imagine that I want to do a search for how different books that are talking about Judaism at the time of Jesus, when they are referring to a specific Bible text, like this week's text about Luke 6, Jesus and his disciples going through the cornfield, and they take some grains and then they eat it, and there is a discussion, is this allowed on the Sabbath or not? how can we find books that are talking about Judaism at the time of Jesus that discuss this Bible text? Well, the first thing we need to do is to group some books together. You can either make a collection. If you go up into tools, you can make a collection here. Another way is to tag some books, and right now I want to show how to do some tagging. So you go to the library, and in order to open the library in one big window, you just click and drag it so it fills the screen, and you let go of the mouse button, and here you have your library open, filling the whole screen. At the right hand side you have a button called prioritize. What that one does is, right now if you haven't prioritized any books before, it will be empty. But if you put some books in here, for instance the first book you put in here is going to be your prioritized Bible. So whenever Logos is opening a Bible for you, it's going to open the first Bible it can find in this list. So if you are a New King James Version fan, if you wanted that to be your favorite Bible, you click on the title and you drag it over here to the prioritized column. And now, since New King James is the top Bible, it's going to choose this Bible whenever it needs to open a Bible. If you have some commentaries that you love, maybe some Tyndale commentary, you can just click and drag it over here. And since that's now my top Bible, whenever Logos needs to open some commentaries, it's going to open the Tyndale commentaries first. So find the books you want here in the library field and drag it over into the prioritize column. And the first Bible is going to be your prioritized Bible. The first commentary will be your prioritized commentaries. Let me just delete it again. You can right click and remove from this list. You see that my prioritized commentaries is the Andrew Study Bible Notes, New American Commentary, IVP, because these commentaries happen to be commentaries that a lot of you have in your SDA packages, so I prioritize them so that it shows up when I demonstrate things for you in Logos. The top Greek and Hebrew lexicons, the top Bible dictionaries, you can just put them here in the list of priority, and that's what Logos is going to show you first. If you haven't spent time prioritizing books, please go ahead and do that, so that Logos will show you the books you like the most. Another thing you can do in the library is to tag books. For instance, if you write Adventist, Logos is going to show you all your Adventist books, or at least some of them. And if you do Control A, it's going to select all these books, and now you can click on this I button here, resource information. It's going to open up another window, and here you can see there are so many resources selected, and you click on add tag, and now you can add a tag to it. You can maybe write SDA, and then now all these Adventist books will be tagged with the tag SDA. Alright, so go ahead and go through the different books you have in your library. Give them different tags. You see I have tagged books as like SDA, Systematic Modern Short. This is a short book on systematic theology. Some books on Sabbath I've tagged as Sabbath. Like Sigve Tonstad's book, The Lost Meaning of the Seventh Day. A lot of you have that if you have the SDA Silver package. Ministry Leadership, and so on and so on. I've gone through all my books and tagged them. And the benefit of doing that is you can easily find things again. So I have a tag called Judaism, which are all my books about Judaism. And I have one called it's called New Testament 1. That's all my books on the Gospels. I've divided the New Testament into different sections. So all NT1, that's all my books on the Gospels. NT2, all my books on Acts. NT3, all my books on Paul. NT4, all my books on the general epistles. NT5, all my books on Revelation. NT1, Judaism, is all my books that talk about Judaism related to the Gospels. Or I have another tag called Judaism Second Temple. These are all the books that I have that relate to Judaism at the time of Jesus. And the Second Temple was, began with the rebuilding of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the Jews had returned to Jerusalem after the period in Babylon. And this temple lasted all the way until it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. This period we call the Second Temple period Judaism. And so I tagged all the books I have that are talking about Judaism in this period as Judaism Second Temple. So I can easily find these books again. So I just find the books one by one. I went through my library, and then when I found the book, I gave it some tags. All right. You can make whatever tags you want, whatever makes sense to you. Now, let's do a search. You see this search icon here? Let's drag it down so it fills the whole screen. Then it's easier to find something. Now we're going to do a basic search. You click on basic. You have basic means you're searching your whole library of books. Bible means you're searching for words just in the Bible. Media, you're searching for images, videos in your library. Clause, morphology, syntax, are more grammatical searches. That's more complicated, maybe for another day. Now we're going to do a basic search. Search the whole library, and you can choose to search everything. You can search some collections if you made collections up in the tools. Or in my case, I have made a lot of tags. Right here, a lot of tags I have. I can search for my Judaism Rabbinic or Judaism Second Temple period. Let's go ahead and let me do the Judaism Second Temple. All right. Now, what we want to search for is a Bible text. If you scroll down, you will see that there is a lot of help for you here, how you can search for things. If you want to search for a word, just type the word. If you want to search for all the words, you just write the words. And then all these words have to be included in the search result in order for it to show up. But if you are happy with any of the words, either faith or hope or love, you can just use commas between them. So this page will show you how to write the search, the syntax for the search. Now further down it says references, Bible reference. If you put a Bible reference in these arrows here, then the Logos is going to search either your entire library, or in my case, all the books I have tagged with Judaism Second Temple with this Bible reference. So let me go ahead and let's search for pages in my Judaism books that talk about the story of Jesus going with his disciples through the cornfield and plucking some grain. That story is found in Mark 2, 23 to 28. So we write it like this. Comma means or if Logos finds something with Luke 6, 1 to 5. If we do a search now, Logos will now search all my books tagged Judaism Second Temple that are talking about these two Bible texts. Either one is fine. So let's see if we can find something interesting here. Now you might not have these specific books. Logos is not only a software, it is also a digital platform for books. It's a library system for books. You can buy books in Logos system. You can buy books one by one to expand your digital library. And so I have bought quite a lot of books because I'm a pastor and I'm a university professor. So I probably might have more books than you do in your Logos library right now, but if you want to buy some of these books, you can buy them at any time. I'm going to show you afterwards which books it is in Logos, on the Logos website. But one of these, it says Ancient Text for New Testament Studies, written by Craig Evans, who is one of the leading evangelical New Testament scholars today. He's written this introduction on Judaism and other elements of the culture at the time of the New Testament. Some ancient texts you need to know if you want to understand the New Testament. On page 253, the halakha of Jesus. Halakha has to do with the commandments, the law, how to interpret the commandments in the Pentateuch, in the books of Moses. And here he shows that he says that Rabbi Simeon ben Mensaya, who lived 150 years after Jesus, he says, "Behold, it says, and you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy unto you." This means So this rabbi is quoting Exodus 31, and then the rabbi gives an interpretation. This means, the Sabbath is given to you, but you are not surrendered to the Sabbath. You are not given to the Sabbath. Doesn't that sound a lot like what Jesus was saying in this text? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for our blessing. We are not surrendered to the Sabbath. We are not given over to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is given to us. This is in the Mechilta, which is a commentary on Exodus 31. This is part of the rabbinic literature. So, other rabbis were saying things that were fairly similar to what Jesus was saying. Jesus wasn't the only one who spoke like this. Alright, let's look at some other books. Christian Origins by Roland is an interesting book. Jesus and the Torah. Let's open that one. You see, I have done some underlining here. In the tools, you can choose some colors to underlining, and you can assign some shortcuts. So if I want to underline something now, let me open this. Tools, highlighting. You can choose some colors that you want to use for underlining, and you can assign some colors to it. So assign some shortcuts on the keyboard. You see here that I have assigned the letter Y on my keyboard. So if I now highlight something, and I just type Y on the keyboard, whoa, it's highlighted with yellow because I gave that shortcut. Pretty useful. Alright, so I have highlighted before in a saying which has some marked similarities with Jesus' saying at the conclusion of this debate. Rabbi Simeon ben Manasseh, mid-2nd century, said, "The Sabbath is given to you, but you are not given to the Sabbath. You're not surrendered to the Sabbath." That's the same rabbinic statement that we just read in the other book. So Jesus was talking like other rabbis were talking. And he says, the Sabbath controversies show Jesus unwilling at any point to deny the validity of Sabbath observance, but more than willing to interpret Sabbath observance in such a way that it did not become a bondage for anyone. This is Christopher Roland in his book Christian Origins, about the beginning of this messianic sect of Judaism, which turned out to be Christianity. So these things are very typical for a new group of scholars that are coming out. This is now more and more mainstream scholarship, that people see that Jesus kept the Sabbath. Jesus didn't deny the validity of Sabbath observance. He kept the Sabbath, but he tried to interpret it in a way that it wasn't a bondage for people. This is very typical of scholars these days. We can take one more example for you. It's an interesting book called The Quest for the Historical Pharisee. Where did the book go? Maybe it was in one of the other Judaism collections. Well, we can also open the book directly in the command field. We just write the Quest of the Historical Pharisee. Let's open this book. So here, this is a book written by one Christian and one Jewish scholar. Jacob Neusner is one of the most famous Jewish scholars today, a scholar on Rabbinic Judaism and Second Temple period Judaism. Bruce Chilton is a Christian New Testament scholar. And in this book about who were the Pharisees really. They're quite different from what a lot of people imagine them to have been. Very good book. I highly recommend it. Here they have a discussion about Mark 2 and the story about plucking the grain on the Sabbath. And they talk about the way Jesus referred to the story in Samuel about David seeking refuge in the sanctuary. It was supposed to be just the priests who was eating this holy bread, but on Sabbath the breads were exchanged. The old ones were taken out and the new ones came in. So maybe when David came and asked for, "Do you have some food?" The priest said, "Yeah, we have some food. We have some food here. We have these holy bread." Maybe it was because that's a rabbinic tradition. Maybe it was because it had just been replaced in the sanctuary. So maybe it was a Sabbath. Maybe that's why Jesus is making the connection to this story about David. Anyway, it talks about the prohibition against plucking a neighbor's grain with basket in hand effectively prevented a needy person from preparing in advance for the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy there is this statement that we can find it. Instead of me just talking about it, let's go to the passage guide. Let's find Luke 6, the story about Jesus going through the cornfield with his disciples. Let's go to cross-references. And in Deuteronomy 23, it is, right? So, if you go to passage guide, cross-references, you will find a lot of Bible texts that are relevant, that are related to the text you are discussing. So, since we're discussing Luke 6 and Mark 2, it says, oh, what about, Deuteronomy 23? That might be an interesting text. It also shows, of course, 1 Samuel 21, the story about David getting some bread to eat. But here are some more texts, and if you open them, if you do some homework before Sabbath, and you open Deuteronomy 23, of course, the computer got a little bit slow there, but then there is this rule that says that if you're hungry and you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you can eat some of these grapes, as long as you don't, take any with you. You don't bring a container to do harvesting. Or when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand. You see, now it has chosen my New King James because I prioritized it. So, prioritize the Bibles you like. Alright, so if you're hungry, you go into the neighbor's cornfield, grain field, you can pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle. You shouldn't take a lot from him, just what you can with your hand. So, Jesus and the disciples were not stealing. This was allowed according to Deuteronomy, but it was the Sabbath. So, was this work or was it not work? Is this something you can do without violating the command against not working? Well, that was a big discussion. And so it says in this book here, the prohibition against plucking a neighbor's grain with basket in hand effectively prevented a needy person from preparing in advance for the Sabbath day. So what should the poor person do to get food on Sabbath? He was not allowed to, bring his sickle or his basket to gather a lot. Well, he was maybe allowed to walk on Sabbath, or wasn't he? Well, that was a big discussion. And some people said, well, that would be work. So for many of the Pharisees, the interpretation of the Sabbath commandment meant that, in effect, a poor person who on other days could receive benevolence from his neighbor would have to go hungry on the Sabbath. For Mark's Jesus, or Luke's Jesus, this was an unthinkable interpretation of the law. So there was a lot more discussion about what to do on the Sabbath and what not to do on the Sabbath in Judaism at the time. And a lot of scholars include more and more discussions about Judaism at the time. The discussion was a lot more nuanced than many of us maybe think. And a lot of them come to the conclusion that Jesus didn't cancel the Sabbath. Instead, he wanted to give his proper interpretation of the Sabbath. This is a growing trend in scholarship. Very interesting from an Adventist perspective. To show you one fourth book, John Mayer, professor at Notre Dame in Indiana, is one of the leading historians about the historical Jesus. He's written 4 volumes about the historical Jesus called A Marginal Jew. And in his 4th volume, which is about law and love, what Jesus said about the commandments, he's very explicit when it comes to Jesus and Sabbath keeping. Jesus kept the Sabbath. He's very clear about that. He also has this reference to the Makilta commentary on Exodus 31, where Rabbi Simeon says, the Sabbath is handed over to you, you are not handed over to the Sabbath. A lot of people refer to that story because Jesus wasn't the only one who said that the Sabbath is supposed to be a blessing for us. It's given to us. We are not given to the Sabbath. As with Jesus, so with Rabbi Simeon, the point of the saying is the setting of priorities. Even Sabbath observance has its limitations. In the immediate context, Rabbi Simeon uses this saying to teach that rescuing endangered human life takes precedence over the Sabbath. Thus, far from being an anything goes antinomian slogan, some Christians say, oh, Jesus is cancelling the Sabbath. Jesus is now showing you can do whatever you want on the Sabbath. No, Jesus does not teach anything goes. antinomian means, against the law. The law is cancelled. Instead, this saying of Jesus focuses on the type of emergency that permits one to ignore Sabbath restrictions. Restrictions that some Jews thought we should have on the Sabbath, which Jesus says these restrictions are not necessary. Let's find, there's a lot of discussion here in John Mayer, Marginal Jew, about Sabbath keeping. By the way, if you want to navigate a little bit fast in your books, if you happen to have underlined things in your book before, maybe on your iPad you've done some underlining or highlighting, or on the computer, if you want to find the next annotation, make sure that you're showing the locator bar. So click on the book icon, mark show locator bar, so that this bar here shows up which chapter you're in, and then there will be a drop down menu. You can jump from article to article, or chapter to chapter. You can jump from page to page if you want to go through a book page by page, or if you have done some annotation, some highlighting, underlining, you can say, take me to the next one. He's saying a lot here. Time is running. Let me just quote a little bit from him. I think this is, from an Adventist perspective, this is fun. This is almost, yeah, I'm laughing every time I read it. This is mainstream scholarship today. Jesus was a Sabbath keeper. This Catholic leading biblical scholar says, far from a Paul disguised as Jesus, who preaches gospel versus law, which is a caricature of Paul to begin with, Even Paul actually didn't preach law versus grace, law versus gospel. And the historical Jesus certainly did not. The historical Jesus turns out to be the halakhic Jesus, the law-keeping Jesus, the Jesus who is concerned with the right, proper way to keep the law. Halakhic means what has to do with the law. And now, this is funny. The idea of Jesus consciously or unconsciously attacking, subverting, or annulling the Sabbath, even apart from the penalty of death, at least in theory, for a serious transgression of Sabbath law. This idea of Jesus attacking or annulling the Sabbath is too ludicrous to be taken seriously. Well, despite the fact that it has been taken seriously by many a critic. For many scholars, Jesus cancelled the Sabbath. But that's just too ludicrous. How can people even think that? All questers for the historical Jesus, all historians, everybody who wants to find out what did the historical Jesus say and do, they should repeat the following mantra even in their sleep. The historical Jesus is the halakhic Jesus. Is the law-keeping Jesus. He didn't cancel the commandments of the Torah. He kept them, including the Sabbath. When it comes to the Sabbath, Jesus presupposes and affirms the sacred institution enshrined in the Torah, all the while arguing against sectarian rigorism and in favor of a humane, moderate approach to detailed questions of observance. Yet when it comes to divorce and oaths, to key social institutions permitted and regulated by the Torah, Jesus totally forbids both divorce and swearing. Two prohibitions that, as far as we can tell, were unheard of among the various competing Jewish parties and sects of his day. So yes, Jesus did at times disagree with some of the common ways of interpreting the commandments, but when it comes to the Sabbath, Jesus upheld the Sabbath, just like he upheld marriage and was against divorce. So, John Mayer, the leading historical Jesus historian today, says Jesus kept the Sabbath and taught people to keep the Sabbath. And if you believe Jesus annulled the Sabbath, that's just too ludicrous. So this is scholarship today. It has come a long way from when I started doing theology 25 years ago. It's an exciting time to be an Adventist. Jesus kept the Sabbath. And if we want to be followers of Jesus, I suggest that we do as our Master did. There are a lot of interesting Bible texts in this week's lesson about Luke and Jesus and Sabbath keeping. I suggest that you study all of them. I promised I would show you the books in the Logos that I referred to. If you want to buy some more books, these are the books I have talked about. Christopher Rowland, Christian Origins, Craig Evans, Ancient Text for New Testament Studies. The book about In Quest of the Historical Pharisee is part of a bigger collection of 4 books, so you can't buy it individually yet, maybe in the future. And finally, John Mayer's 4 volumes on the historical Jesus is fairly expensive. But if you're really into gospel studies, this is the most important scholarly book on the historical Jesus available today. He is one of the leading scholars, so you might find those books interesting. Now, if you want to take a look at Paul and Judaism and the new perspectives on Paul, there is a very good article that you should read, that you have. Everybody has the Lexham Bible Dictionary. You don't need to buy it. You have it in your collection, whatever collection you have. Everybody has the Lexham Bible Dictionary. And if you, in this box here, you open the book, Lexham Bible Dictionary, if you just type in Paul, new perspective, you click on it and you will be taken to this article on this new attitude among a lot of scholars about Paul and Judaism, and that Judaism at the time of Jesus maybe wasn't that legalistic that we thought it was, and that Paul wasn't so much against the law as a lot of Protestants have thought. For some Protestants, some Lutherans, Pentecostals, Dispensationalists, Paul was very much against the law. He was cancelling the law. We're living in the new covenant where the old covenant commandments are annulled. Well, not so fast, says the new perspective on Paul. Read this very interesting article. You have it in your library. Before I let you go, today's video turns out to be a long one. I'll try to make it shorter again next week. But I want to just quickly take you to 2 passages in Paul about the Sabbath that a lot of people think is negating Sabbath keeping. But actually that's not what Paul is talking about at all. And I want to show you some resources you have in your Logos library. In Romans 14, from verse 5, it says that one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor for the Lord. Some people think this refers to Sabbath keeping and which day is the holy day to keep. You know, some people say Sabbath, some people say Sunday. Paul says you can keep whatever day you want. But Paul is not talking about the holy day to keep. He's not talking about the Sabbath. He's talking about the day of fasting. Because if you keep reading, the very next sentence, the one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. While the one who abstains, if you don't eat, if you abstain from eating, it's called fasting. You fast in honor of the Lord. Now you might ask the question, did the early Christians really discuss which days you should fast and which days you should eat? Is that really a discussion? Yes, it was. And if you open one resource you have, which is called the Apostolic Fathers, you can either go to the library and open it, or you can do it here in the command window. If you write the word lake, you will see it says Open Lakes Apostolic Fathers in English. It's an old translation, more than 100 years old. The best translation into modern English is Michael Holmes, if you want to buy Michael Holmes' Apostolic Fathers, but all of you already have this one, so let me show you in this one. If you go to the document called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which wasn't written by the 12 Apostles, but somebody pretending to be them probably. But it's an interesting document, probably the earliest document outside the New Testament, written probably in the 1st century even. The Didache, and if you go to section 8, it says, let not your fasts be with the hypocrites. This is some anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish statement here. The hypocrites are probably the Jews. A lot of them fast on Mondays and Thursdays. On the 2nd and 5th day of the week is what it says in the Greek here. But you, as a Christian, you should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Don't fast when the Jews fast. Fast on the Christian days of fasting. And what does Paul say? Well, each should just be fully convinced in his own mind. Whatever day you observe, whatever day you keep for fasting, the one who eats eats in the name of the Lord, the one who abstains, who doesn't eat, but who is fasting. Whatever day you want to fast, that's fine. So this is not at all about Sabbath keeping, it's about days of fasting. And how do we know? Well, this was a big discussion in the early church. And you can find it by opening the Apostolic Fathers and the document that Didache. Another text that is often used about Sabbath, saying this negates weekly Sabbath keeping, is Colossians 2:16. Colossians, I was supposed to say, 2:16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, new moon, or Sabbaths. A lot of Christians say this refers to annual, monthly, and weekly keeping of festivals. It kind of makes sense, annual festivals, new moon, and Sabbath, especially since it's translated as singular, the Sabbath. Now, unfortunately, this is a bad translation. If you right-click on the word Sabbath, you will see that Sabbaton is in the plural. It should rather be translated as Sabbaths, plural. Why is it not translated as Sabbaths? Because that might remind you that there are many Sabbaths in the Pentateuch, in the Old Testament. You had the weekly Sabbath, but you also had ceremonial Sabbath, like the Day of Atonement was a Sabbath, even if it fell on a Wednesday or a Monday. The Day of Atonement, the Day of Pentecost, were several days that were called Sabbaths, even if, no matter what day of the week they fell on. So what is Paul talking about? Is it the Sabbaths, the ceremonial Sabbaths, or is it the weekly Sabbath? Well, the way to find out is Paul making some kind of quotation from the Old Testament here? And yes, he is. If I open another text here, and if we go to Hosea 2:11, we see that, oh yeah, wow, look at this. He is quoting the Old Testament, Hosea 2:11. That God wants to put an end to all Israel's feasts, new moons, and Sabbaths. Feasts, new moons, and Sabbath. This is a quotation. Now, do we now know whether Hosea is talking about ceremonial Sabbaths or the weekly Sabbath? Yes, we know, because in the Pentateuch, whenever God is talking about the weekly Sabbath, he's using pronouns like my Sabbath. And when he is talking about the ceremonial Sabbath, he's using the preposition, the pronouns her or your. Your Sabbaths, her Sabbaths, Israel's Sabbath. How do I know that? Well, because I've been reading one of the books you have in your Logos library. At least if you have the SDA Silver package. I don't think it's in all the SDA packages, but if you have SDA Silver, you can get this. You have this book by Ron Dupree. Otherwise, you can buy it. Judging the Sabbath, discovering what can't be found in Colossians. Ron Dupree revives this old argument from Jane Andrews, the missionary to Adventist missionary to Europe, whose Andrews University is named after. He was the first to make the connection to Hosea 2:11. And Jane Andrews made the argument that, hey, look at the Pentateuch. When it's talking about her Sabbath or your Sabbath, it's talking about the ceremonial Sabbath. And if you want all the statistics and all the Bible texts, just go to this book by Ron Dupree. It's an excellent book talking about Colossians 2:16. So, I just wanted to end this video about two texts, Romans 14, Colossians 2, that are sometimes used against Sabbath keeping, saying Sabbath keeping is no longer necessary. Actually, those two texts do not talk about the weekly Sabbath at all. And if you go to the Gospels, it is very clear that Jesus was a Sabbath keeper, and he taught his followers to keep the Sabbath. And that's what mainstream scholarship is concluding these days. More and more scholars saying, that's right, Jesus was the halakhic Jesus. Jesus kept the commandments, and he taught his followers to do the same. My name is Raymar Vettner. Thank you for following me in this week's video about Logos and the Sabbath. I will see you again next week.